Hello, everyone. Today we're going to continue to look at energy and how we can green our energy supply. I've entitled this lecture, The Roadmap to a Clean Energy Future. Before I start and get too deep into this topic, I want to say there's good news here. As you'll see, the price of renewables has come way down, and a future where the grid consists of 100% clean energy is within our grasps. And we can do this now, unlike a decade ago, without causing economic damage. On the contrary, today when countries are thinking about adding more energy supply, and at least where they have an open market, renewables usually win out on price. So the market today is actually favoring renewables over fossil fuels. But we'll see how path dependencies, well-organized opposition, governments who are connected to powerful fossil fuel industries are delaying this transition to clean energy. So first of all, I'd like to begin this talk by describing how we got to where we are today. It's been a long process. It's involved shifting global leadership, and we are by no means at the end of this process yet, but as I've mentioned, the trends are looking very favorable. Again, if the will is there, we have now the capacity to move towards essentially 100% clean energy, at least in our electric grid, with very little need. One could argue that we have the capacity already to go 100% without fossil fuels. All right, I want to start out by saying that initially the United States was the leader in this endeavor. We owe Bell Labs. Bell Labs is a long story, but it was a remarkable research entity. A lot of the things we take for granted now, including our cell phones, were developed largely by Bell Labs. Bell Labs also is responsible for eventually giving us computer chips, developing the technology that led to computer chips. Could go on and on, radar, microwaves. This was an amazing entity, and it's a pity that there's nothing like it in the United States today. If we were more aware of our history, we would be trying to create some public-private partnerships that mimic what used to go on at Bell Labs. But Bell Labs created the first solar cell back in 1954. Problem was, for technology scales, it's always very expensive. So Bell Labs was looking for a way to use this technology, and for a while it didn't find any use. It thought maybe that it could power remote stations. I should say AT&T, which owned Bell Labs, pretty much had a monopoly on the phone system at the time, and they looked into powering remote stations that would relay signals, but found that it was just uneconomical even to use their own solar cells. So the first real customer for PV was NASA. Putting rockets and satellites into space, you need a renewable source of energy. You cannot put that much liquid fuel up there and expect it to last. So interestingly, the Apollo project in the 1960s not only helped advance solar energy, but also fuel cells. There were a number of things that, from a renewable energy perspective, that were really useful about the Apollo project. So in the United States, in the 1960s, we now have this nascent market for solar cells. It is space. In Japan, they start looking also at solar technology. Their response is very different. Their response is to try to miniaturize it and put it into things like calculators, wristwatches, with the idea that over time you would scale up and use it to power larger and larger objects. Now, moving along to the 70s, you have two oil shocks. The first is the Arab countries decided to turn the spigot off to Western countries that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And that created a huge shock to the US economy. Oil prices went way up. It was hard to even get gasoline. People were hoarding gasoline like people have been hoarding toilet paper during the coronavirus crisis. People would have to wait in line in their cars all day to see if they could get gas, often being turned away after many hours because the gas station would run out of gas. The reality is, at this point, the US economy was used energy very inefficiently. As a result, higher energy prices really walloped the US economy. And just after we were beginning to recover from the first oil shock in the later 70s, major oil producing companies organized a cartel called OPEC. And what was significant about OPEC was that their goal was to keep prices high and to do so by limiting the supply of oil. And with the creation of OPEC, prices again went way up, and the US experienced twin recessions in the 1970s, largely linked to inflation connected to oil. The US, again, is very sensitive to increase in the price of energy. This created political will on both sides of the aisle to do something about energy. You heard a lot about the US becoming energy independent, beginning with President Nixon, the first president of the decade. You had things like 55-mile-an-hour speed limits in order to, at 55 miles an hour back then, combustion engines were most efficient. So this was a good way to reduce energy consumption. But beyond that, they instituted corporate average fuel efficiency standards. The idea was to push car companies to make cars constantly more energy efficient. These were just two of a broad range of steps that were taken by leaders on both sides of the political aisle, President Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Carter is very notable because Carter also looked strongly at renewable energy. He promoted the idea of energy independence, with renewables eventually becoming an important part of the energy mix. Under Jimmy Carter, the US Department of Energy launched the Solar Energy Research Institute. It was a federal facility dedicated to harnessing power from the sun. Today, that's the National Renewable Energy Lab. Sad fact is that it never got a lot of funding. It wasn't until 2007 that the money was committed to even give them a building. Now, Carter did other things like put solar panels on the White House, trying to send a message that this was a new form of energy, and the US was going to be a global leader in creating this new source of abundant clean energy. Now, Ronald Reagan then is elected in 1980, and you get a very different tone than you had in the 1970s. Ronald Reagan was elected with overwhelming backing from the fossil fuel companies. The fossil fuel companies were not happy with what President Carter had been doing and tilted their contributions towards Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's message was, it was against energy efficiency. He said that we didn't have a problem of demand, it was a problem of supply. We just had to go out there and encourage energy companies like oil companies to drill more for energy. So if you incentivize them, they would go out and do that. So Ronald Reagan was not only pro-fossil fuels, he also tacked the budget for the Solar Energy Research Institute. At the time when Reagan took office, this was a powerful scientist. As the budget got slashed, this group of scientists was forced to disperse. And it was chilling in the sense that if you're a physics or chemistry PhD student and you're thinking about what you're going to do, if you see that funding for renewable energy is very unstable, you're going to be based on what you've seen and the experience of those that have come before you, you're going to be reluctant to focus on this as a career choice. And so Reagan had a very chilling effect on renewable energy. Fortunately, things didn't stop. In Germany in the 1970s and 80s, you had a very powerful anti-nuclear movement. People still had in their minds the destruction of World War II. They also were very scared about the idea. So in the 1970s, the US is beginning to change its military doctrine away from mutually assured destruction. It's the idea that the US and the Soviet Union would never engage in using nuclear weapons because we'd be assured to destroy each other, to US doctrine change to one of using tactical nuclear weapons. And the idea was that the Soviet Union had too many tanks on the line between East and West. So Germany at the time is divided, where the Soviet Union controlled East Germany. And America had large numbers of bases in what was Western Germany, along with England and France, other NATO countries. But Soviet Union had huge numerical superiority when it came to conventional weapons like tanks. So the US decided that in a conventional war, it would be okay to use tactical nuclear weapons to neutralize the tank advantage that the Soviets had. And Germans didn't like this, especially young Germans, because basically they thought about it for a second and they're like, oh, you're talking about fighting a nuclear war where I live. That was one of the things that fed this really strong objection to nuclear energy in general, not just nuclear weapons. And at the time, in the 70s, there were big plans to expand the number of nuclear power plants. And around southwest Germany, around the town of Freiburg, people who were very progressive, Greens, joined up with conservative farmers to fight against these nuclear power plants. There was a series of them planned for this region to industrialize this region. And it was not only in Germany, but across the border in France that there was this plan to build a huge number of nuclear plants. Interestingly, unified people from both sides that had historically been enemies. France and Germany had fought many wars. And a combination of students and farmers led the opposition to these nuclear power plants. While this was going on, people started to think we just can't be against something. If we're going to be against something, we have to be for something. And what's an odd twist is they looked across the Atlantic and they saw what Jimmy Carter was trying to do and promotion of renewable energy. And they said, we like that. That's what we're for. And beginning in the 70s, these farmers actually put together the first large solar expo, later moved into Freiburg. Today, it's outgrown Freiburg. It's in Munich, Germany. But they started talking about future based on renewable energy. This started to gain grassroots momentum. And in 1991, it led to the first Electricity Feed-in Act. I'll talk about what a feed-in tariff is. You got a taste of it earlier in the semester when we saw this film on how Germany powered its renewable energy revolution. However, it didn't really move the needle very much. The price set for the feed-in tariff wasn't high enough. So 9 years later, the Parliament of Germany goes back and passes the Renewable Energy Source Act, also known as EEG. And it is, to refresh your memory, the feed-in tariff had three features to it. Each type of renewable energy had its own price, and initially those prices were set very high, and they would come down over time. Because of these high prices, you had many small holders join together, form energy cooperatives, farmers, households, all jumped into becoming part of the energy transition. You can think of it almost investing in a stock. You're investing instead in a windmill or a few windmills or a solar array. The idea was also that this wasn't a subsidy just because it wasn't coming from taxpayers. It was coming from consumers paying higher prices with industry being exempt. Um, and it was going to drive innovation with the idea that the feed-in tariff was going to decrease over time. So companies, to survive, were going to have to become more nimble and learn to live without the support of the feed-in tariff. So Germany plays a really important role in the energy transition because other countries begin to copy what Germany does. And what Germany does is that it allows this industry to begin to scale. As it begins to grow in size, you get more companies moving into the space. Competition is unleashing economies of scale and improvement in technology. And the effect of this is to drive prices down. Think about any new technology and how important early adopters are. When it comes out, take something even as ancient now as DVD players. When those came out in the early 90s, they were incredibly expensive. A really bad DVD player cost like $1,000 and there wasn't much you could do with it except watch a few blockbusters. Early adopters helped scale the industry, and within 20 years you could go to Walmart and get a DVD player for about 30, 40 bucks. That was much better than the $1,000 DVD player from 15, 20 years ago. So that's what happens when manufacturing has this capacity to scale. And German policy essentially had that impact, that it caused these industries, especially solar, onshore wind, to scale. China looked at what Germany was doing and thought, we want to dominate the industries of the future. And this is clearly one of those industries of the future. And China, much to Germany's dislike, jumped in a major way with government subsidizing the growth of renewable energy companies. And especially when it came to panel manufacturing, took away most of the business from Germany. Most panel manufacturers in Germany ended up going bankrupt. Although Germany still creates huge numbers of jobs in renewable energy, still has lots of jobs in the solar space. They're just making other equipment rather than panels. So I want to highlight what are some of the new technologies that have been scaling during the previous decade, and one that's just started to scale in about the last 5 or 6 years. So solar PV, onshore wind, electric vehicles and hybrids, LED lights, which seem insignificant, but given that how important buildings are when it comes to energy use, and the role that lighting plays, when you can cut by 85% the amount of electricity used by lighting, that's a huge advancement. So when it comes to scaling, solar panels over a 35-year period from 1980 to 2015 dropped by 99% and continued to drop price after 2015. Wind power on land during 32-year period dropped by 90%. And LED lights not only use 85% less energy, but in a 4-year period from 2008 to 2012, the price dropped by 85%. We talked in an earlier lecture about indoor agriculture. It's this drop in price and this new type of lighting that uses so little energy, which has unleashed the potential of indoor agriculture. So learning curves, we talk about when you essentially double production, what it means to the price reduction. So every time you double the amount of solar panels being produced, you see a 24% drop in price. For onshore wind manufacturing, for the making the components that go into nacelles, blades, etc. It's a 14% reduction. For batteries, we've been on a very impressive downward trend of 20%. Here you can see the price history of silicon-based PV wafers. Since 2015, the price has continued to drop. Might not always be reflected now in global prices because we've seen tariffs being used, one could argue, especially in the case of the United States, deliberately to slow down the installation of solar energy. So you've probably heard of Moore's Law with regards to computing power. Swanson's Law is about the relationship between price and the amount of manufacturing that goes on, and as you increase manufacturing, by what rate price goes down. And it's a pretty good fit, kind of like Moore's Law for computing. So I mentioned there was one other technology that's joined the party, kind of surprisingly. If we were to go back 7, 8 years ago, most people thought offshore wind was still kind of a loser, that countries like Denmark that had a lot of offshore wind had paid too much for it. But then the technology began to change quickly, and Catherine Collins discusses this in her talk. Blades, turbines started to get bigger and bigger. As they got bigger, they had to be manufactured on the coast and shipped out on barges, but Great Britain kind of mastered this. China has also mastered this. And what we've seen is we've moved from, if you look at the windmills that are off the coast of Denmark, a lot of them are 15 years, 20 years old. These are like 0.5 to 2 megawatts, usually 2 megawatts. Those are expensive to install and you need a lot of them. What we're seeing now is we're moving to 8 megawatts to 10 to 12, and now Dong Energy is doing a project soon that's going to have 15 megawatt turbines. To put that into perspective, a pretty much average size coal plant has a 400 megawatt capacity. So what you're talking about here is with a 10 megawatt, for example, it takes 40 wind turbines to equal a coal plant. You go to 15 megawatts, again, the number is needed is a lot less to replace energy from fossil fuels like coal. So the price of offshore wind has been falling super fast with this new way of doing it. Between 2015 and 2017, the price came down by 50%. The reason for this has everything to do with size. I mentioned, comparing it to Denmark, which was the initial global leader in offshore wind. One of these giants, of today's giants, can produce as much as entire offshore wind farm that became operational in 1992. Denmark, you might say, paid a lot for what it got early on, but it also got benefits. So if you're thinking about why be an early leader, Denmark today is a major name, and place where important companies like Vestas are located that are big players in the wind industry. Subsidizing this industry early on helped Denmark become an important player today. Here's the Dong Energy project that I mentioned. It's going in what's called the Hornsea project. So when it comes to scaling, you have this virtuous feedback. It's a mixture of policy, technology, and scale that interact to get with one another. So low carbon footprint, as societies determine, at least some more than others, to do something about carbon change, send policy signals that attract investment. Policy investment also in R&D helps generate innovative new technologies. This is accelerated because you have this market demand. Over time, these technologies become more mainstream. Customers begin to accept it. opposition begins to melt away, this, most places, creates a reinforcement that leads to further policies that, again, it's this virtuous feedback loop. It's kind of working well here in the US until the 2016 election, which has thrown up, and we've been trying to throw a lot of hurdles, unfortunately, in the way of clean energy in the last few years in the United States. It's different, though, in most other countries. You know, another aspect of a big revolution like the energy transition is that it creates opportunities for new players and it threatens old players. So you see businesses getting into energy production like Walmart, Lowe's, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, Facebook. These are just a few examples. Today, commercial scale storage is leading the way, often in battery usage. Commercial and industrial deployment of renewables has kept renewable energy transition going in the United States, even when the federal government has put a lot of hurdles up. At the same time, you've also seen the creation of a lot of new companies. Like right in our backyard, we have Strata Solar, which has become a fairly large company. Other examples include SunEdison, Sungevity, Solar City, First Solar. All of these are companies that have opened up and grown in this new niche. LED companies, we have, used to be before LEDs that 4 companies dominated the global lighting market. With the creation of LED lights, you've seen a whole bunch of new players enter the space. Same thing with electric cars. Some of the legacy companies like GM and Ford and Toyota and Volvo. Well, Volvo is a Chinese company now, but BMW, Mercedes are trying to move rapidly into electric cars. They have a bit more of a difficulty because they have to maintain R&D for both electric and combustion engines. On the other hand, companies like Tesla, BYD, Proterra are all in with regards to electric, and they're really moving the needle. So these are companies that, BYD is a Chinese company that didn't exist 20 years ago, that are really rocking the automotive world today and the world for electric, for buses. Wind power has been kind of the one exception where a lot of the old companies were able to move into wind, like GE and Siemens, but we've also seen some new companies come into being, like Vespa, which is a Danish company. You can see the current projection for solar is up and up and up. That's why if you're thinking about a job and you're interested in clean energy, the solar space is a very safe bet that it might have its ups and downs. People in the industry refer to it as the solar coaster, but this is an area that's going to continue to enjoy lots of growth in the future. This is from the Energy Information Agency. It also shows as the United States adds more power to the grid, what that's going to look like. You can see it's mostly a mix of wind and solar. So I mentioned one difficulty for the renewable energy industry in the United States has been political partisanship, beginning with Ronald Reagan. One of the things Reagan did actually in his first month of office was take away the solar panels from the White House to send a clear signal about where his policies were going with regards to energy. We've also seen enormous opposition to wind and solar. First wind, and lately we're seeing it also with solar. So some of it is coming from property owners who don't want to live near these things because they think it will devalue their property. But often they're fed information that comes from front groups or think tanks that are backed by fossil fuel money. People believe for a while that windmills were too noisy. Now they actually barely make any noise. If if you're talking under a windmill, the volume of your voice is much greater than that of a windmill. So that some people now say that they're dangerous because they're producing noise at a frequency that can harm the brain. There's actually a quack doctor in Australia who's kind of like the quack doctor in England who came up with the vaccine hypothesis. Well, this guy in Australia has connected dozens and dozens of diseases to wind power, which of course there's absolutely no evidence for this. In the US, they've claimed that this could harm the military. Well, if people are putting up windmills all over the world, why would we not want realistic conditions? But there are huge numbers of people who seem to be paid to oppose projects like wind and solar projects now. If you want to go look at something embarrassing for North Carolina, we made about 3 years ago a lot of the late night talk shows when a public hearing meeting in a community along the Virginia border and just almost straight north of the Triangle, even the high school teacher, biology teacher, turned up and said that solar panels were going to take all the sun's energy away from plants. They wouldn't be able to photosynthesize. Another speaker blamed solar panels for making young people move away. It was just an incredible array of just crazy theories being put forth to oppose a solar farm. Right, and let's confront one of the real problems with solar energy in the US, especially in California where we have a lot of it. Solar energy is what's known as an intermittent resource. What's meant by that is the sun isn't always shining. Even on a very sunny day, the sun goes down. And as you add lots of solar to the grid, if you do this without storage, you basically have to turn off your kind of baseload intermediate type generation because solar is flooding the grid. And you can see this is what's known as the duck curve. And then when that solar energy goes away, you have to quickly ramp up like natural gas quickly to cover that demand. And that's very costly. And that's been a legitimate criticism of solar energy, that there comes a point where too much can exist, especially if you don't have storage. When you have solar and onshore wind together, they actually couple very well because wind is mostly stronger at night. Sun isn't shining at night. So when you have both, you don't get this kind of duck curve. But the most important thing is combining them with storage. And storage is dispatchable. And when you build a solar farm with a storage capacity, you are altering that resource from being one that's intermittent to dispatchable. So dispatchable energy is a grid operator's dream. Currently, dispatchable energy sources include natural gas, oil-fired power plants, which don't really exist in the US anymore, hydro, biopower, geothermal, concentrated solar power. It's different between concentrated solar power, that's the kind of solar power where you have a bunch of mirrors focusing it on a tower, and that heats salts up, and salts are basically acting as an energy storage component. They're storing the electricity and heat. Now, these are current forms of dispatchable energy. Now, energy storage is dispatchable too, and people who study the energy scene, the neutral observers versus like big banks, Bloomberg News, think that energy storage is kind of the missing link, and that it's already cheap enough to be deployed on a large scale. And seeing it, especially where state policies encourage it, like California, that it is being deployed on a very large scale. Now, the problem with storage is, how do you properly value it? What is it? It's not really, is it an energy production type of, is it producing energy? The actual reality is that it has a lot of values and they don't really get captured very well by public utilities commissions. So yes, it's storing and then releasing energy. It allows the grid operator to keep more constant current, to create a more resilient grid, because you never know why you might suffer. Even a coal plant or a gas plant could temporarily go offline. Storage gives a lot of value to the grid operator, and we don't really have a good model for treating it with the value it creates, and that's why you require policies to do that. States like New York and California have moved in that direction, which is why a lot of storage is being deployed in those states. So what are the technologies we use for storage? Right now, the two most important technologies are pumped hydro and lithium-ion batteries. Let's first talk about the weaknesses of lithium-ion batteries. One is they can overheat and explode. They don't last very long. They're really, you can get 4 hours of discharge out of them. Even though this industry is scaling quickly, there's competition in the transportation sector for those batteries. Their performance over time is about a 10-year lifetime. And costs. High energy density comes at a price too high for mainstream use. And then we've also got material availability, uncertainty regarding supplies of lithium and cobalt. Cobalt has gotten a lot of attention in that it's got a very ugly supply chain. Some people even think slave labor is used to mine it in parts of Africa where you have warlords who often use people who've been captured to mine cobalt. Pump storage suffers from a lack of available space for new projects. It's the cheapest option. So what is pump storage? Pump storage is you have two lakes, one uphill and one downhill. And when you have, let's say, too much solar energy, like in California, going onto the grid in the summer, you can use that extra energy to pump water uphill. Then when you need that energy at night, you can let the water go downhill and pass through a power a turbine, and you get to produce electricity from that water. Of course, you're losing more energy. You're losing energy when you store it. In this case, it's the amount of energy that had to be used to push that water uphill. But when you have a lot of extra energy, which is often the case now in places that have a lot of solar, this is very good. Again, the problem with that is you don't have a lot of good places to do this, and you have a lot of opposition from environmentalists, from people who own vacation homes. They don't want artificial lakes being created near where they live. They consider this to be damage to the environment, and it's very hard in the United States these days to site new pump storage facilities. So given the problems and the limitations with these technologies, what are other ways that we could store energy? Thermal storage, using extra energy to heat water, to cool it often into ice. Molten salts, which are used in these concentrated solar plants, so use extra electricity to turn it into heat and heat something up like molten salts that can maintain that heat for long periods of time. And when you need the energy, you can take that heat and turn it back into electricity. Flow batteries are a potential competitor to lithium ion. And problem is that right now the best ones involve vanadium, and pretty toxic chemical. But it's possible that zinc or iron chemistries could be used to develop pretty cheap flow batteries. Then when we talk about storage, we also have short versus long term, or short and medium term. So I mentioned lithium ion is good for 2 to 4 hours. Um, Longer duration storage, like seasonal storage, could be short uh, compressed air, where you're using extra energy to pump air into like a salt cavern. It can be on land or right offshore. And when you need energy, you let that compressed air up and it turns a turbine and you can produce electricity. You can have unconventional pumped hydro. Many countries like Germany are looking at old abandoned mines as a way to do this. Um, Another, probably the most promising medium to long-term storage is using hydrogen and SMG power. Um, that's power to gas methane. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking excess um, renewable energy, solar or wind, to create a renewable natural gas. And right now that's probably, when you think about all the opposition to natural gas pipelines in the future might actually carry renewable natural gas. I should say probably, I think they definitely will. But this is going to be an important part of our energy mix in the future, using excess renewable energy to create renewable natural gas. Also with lithium ion, there's a new technology that's coming up. So 2 Asian companies have claimed in the last summer that they have come up with working solid state lithium batteries. So this is significant because unlike lithium ion, there's the fire risk is gone, and there's also much greater energy density. From an electric transportation perspective, it means that when solid state lithium batteries become common and they're put in electric cars, you'll see electric cars with 400 to 600 mile capacity. This will completely do away with range anxiety. They'll also work well in spaces where there's not a lot of space. So a lot of buildings now are being created, especially with zero net energy buildings with storage capacity. These solid state lithium batteries will be super great improvement for storing energy within buildings. So keep your eyes open for solid state lithium. That technology is out there and it's probably going to scale very fast, and it represents a huge improvement on lithium ion. And I want to mention also where energy is going. So we're seeing already the beginning of what's called sector coupling. So if you think about energy in the past, we've tended to distinguish between electricity and then liquid fuels used for mobility, for cars, buses, ships, planes. At least cars and buses pretty soon are going to be using electricity rather than liquid fuel. We're going to have excess electricity be used to produce gas. And many countries, you have central heating systems where city will provide heat for people who live in the city. You're going to see a lot more power production be used to produce heat for in colder climates to heat large urban blocks, houses and buildings. The same is true also. Industry needs a lot of heat, and you can also derive that from electricity generation. So sector coupling is basically an integrated energy system that centers around renewable energy to provide our electricity, to power our vehicles, to create renewable natural gas, and to provide heat that can be used in colder climates to heat cities with. So this is an important concept. It's one that's being already pushed very hard into reality, especially in the Nordic countries, in Europe and Germany. The idea of sector coupling is moving very rapidly. I mentioned also sector coupling will require greater digitization. Those of you who are interested in this sector and are studying computers, the future of energy not only will belong to electric engineers in terms of the technology part of it, but computer science people will play an important role in managing how things link up to one another, in managing demand behind meters as homes become smart homes and buildings become smart buildings. As the grid becomes more complicated, and you see the creation of more and more virtual power plants that are aggregators for many sources of distributed energy and storage. This is going to require the skills of computer scientists to create and maintain this type of grid. So what will this transition look like on the grid? One is we're moving towards low energy carbon sources, so decarbonization. We're going to also see a lot of decentralization. We're going to move away from the old model of few large power plants to energy being produced all over the place. And we're also going to see digitization become very important, whether we're talking about digitization that's occurring behind the meter in buildings, or the type of digitization that's going to be used to integrate all these very decentralized resources of energy production and storage. All right, I want to run through this, do this one last thing and kind of look at the grid again. How is it going to evolve? So if you look at this diagram, this is the grid kind of today. We've got baseload power. These symbols down here, these are the things that can provide the baseload. The baseload is this line down here. The kind of, in the past, it was your big players, like it was your nuclear plants, your coal plants, providing a pretty constant amount of energy that you know you're going to need, even at the lowest levels of demand. Historically, it's been coal and nuclear. You can get baseload from bioenergy, from hydropower. Hydropower a little limited by seasonality, especially in areas that could be prone to droughts. And so, but for the most part, hydro is a very reliable form of baseload. Geothermal power can also kind of mimic baseload power. Because demand fluctuates, you also have this, what's called intermediate and dispatchable. So we've talked about how important dispatchability is for the grid. And historically, dispatchable power sources have been natural gas. We've also had oil-fired generators. Those were pretty common in the United States until the twin oil crises of the 70s. Since then, we've moved pretty exclusively towards natural gas. And then you have hydro again is dispatchable. You can let more water go down the dam, turn the turbine. So hydro, you have a lot of control with hydro. And then this top part is what's called, these are your peakers. And traditional peak load energy has been produced by oil, diesel generation, and natural gas, usually older technology natural gas, rather than mothballing kind of these old plants from the 50s and 60s. You keep them around, and when you need them, like in the summer when everybody's running their air conditioner, later in the day, you can turn them on. Peaker plants are really, they have certain attributes. They're usually very expensive energy and very dirty energy. And one of the things we can do today, and we'll learn more about this, is that we have the capacity now, and it's, from a price point of view, it's effective. We can replace a lot of these aging peaker plants that are really dirty with energy storage technologies. This lithium ion, because again, we're talking about a few hours a day, can certainly play the role that these peaker plants are playing in our grid right now. So this is kind of like the grid of the past. And this is what we're moving to. This is kind of the early transition stage. see now we still have base load, but we're integrating some renewable energy into that base load. Variable sources, so a mixture of wind and solar, so you don't just have a lot of one or the other, because wind is going to produce at night, solar in the daytime. If you're going to flatten out a little bit, that you're not getting a duck curve, it's important to have both of them. Then you still have base load. You still have your intermediate and dispatchable. And this blue line up here, so the peakers are still the same. Eventually, they'll be replaced by storage. But what's beginning to happen in some places like Texas, this demand shift, is that by using real-time pricing, you're discouraging people from coming home at 5 o'clock and turning on all their appliances. So you're beginning to shave that peak down a little bit with demand control policies, basically allowing for real-time pricing. You're giving consumers a nudge. So rather than having to build more dirty peaker plants, you're meeting your energy demand by getting people to maybe turn on their dishwashers and washing machines later in the evening. And here's what we can do to get towards a grid that's almost entirely or all renewable. So baseload power is gone in this scenario. Most of the load is being carried by variable renewable energy sources. Dispatchable sources are playing an important role here. Storage is not listed here, but storage is going to be an important dispatchable resource. Storage is listed up here at the, so dispatchable is more the intermediate part. Storage is listed here, but storage could also play a role here, especially if we can figure out how to get the price of renewable natural gas down. Storage clearly plays a role here in the peak. And then these overproductions, like for when you get too much solar or wind, by creating larger grids that are connected, which is why, again, it's important to connect the 3 different grids in the US, you can import and export energy more when you need it. So a place that's producing too much wind energy during part of the day can either store it or has the option of exporting that energy to important load centers like big cities. So this is what the grid of the future is going to look like. And anybody who tells you that we can never do it without fossil fuels is living in the past. It's very feasible, and one day we're going to have to do this. And this is what it's going to look like. So you can go through this for more information on what the evolution of the grid is going to look like. So with this, I'd like to thank you for having listened to this lecture, and we'll be online later on, and you can ask questions that you might have about this.